This is the type of work the OH-6 was designed for. Operation in the field with an ability to land and take off from very small and unprepared areas. Field operation is the principal subject of this film. But first, we must learn how the OH-6 is handled in two important maneuvers: maximum performance takeoff and steep approach. These maneuvers are two essentials of confined area operation. Every helicopter has somewhat different maximum performance takeoff characteristics and requirements. Power requirements in the OH-6 call for twist grip full open to provide an N2 tach reading of 103%. During the climb, collective pitch must be skillfully manipulated to obtain the desired torque pressure. These are the basic requirements. We'll cover the fine points in a demonstration takeoff over an 80-foot barrier with the aircraft 50 feet from the barrier. With the cyclic in the neutral position, slowly increase RPM to obtain the desired N2 reading of 103% N2 RPM. When N2 is stabilized, check the rest of the panel. Then make sure that you are clear for takeoff. Be sure to check for aircraft overhead. Apply collective slowly and smoothly. Avoid any movement along the ground. Continue to apply pitch. As the OH-6 becomes light on the skids and leaves the ground, adjust the cyclic to a 40-knot airspeed attitude. A constant heading is required to attain smooth ascent. Pitch must be adjusted to maintain the desired torque pressure. In training, maximum performance takeoffs are terminated at about 100 feet. In the field, you terminate as soon as the barrier is cleared by increasing airspeed and adjusting power for a normal climb. As we watch a maximum performance takeoff, we can readily see that the maneuver differs from normal takeoff only in the fact that a gain in altitude is favored over a gain in airspeed. During the early phase of a max takeoff, before achieving 40 knots, you may not be able to make a safe auto-rotation in the event of engine failure. For this reason, maximum performance takeoff should be limited to absolute necessity. For the steep approach usually required in confined area operation, twist grip should be full open. Entry during practice is from traffic pattern altitude. Approach angle is 12 to 15 degrees. And entry airspeed is 60 knots. The angle of approach is the only difference between steep approach and normal approach. Both types of approach are made at an altitude of 300 feet or traffic altitude. And steep approach is initiated at an angle only 4 or 5 degrees greater than normal. With practice, you will learn to recognize the sight pictures for the OH-6. Each aviator will have a slightly different point of view depending on his height. The normal approach, 8 to 10 degrees sight picture, will look about like this. To reach the steep approach entry point, continue beyond the normal approach sight picture until your intended touchdown point looks about like this. To make this steeper descent, a greater reduction of collective pitch is normally required. Airspeed should be kept as closely to 60 knots as possible. A straight angle of descent is maintained by adjustment of collective. The helicopter may be crabbed to maintain a straight ground track above 50 feet. When you reach the point where ground speed and rate of closure seem to increase, adjust airspeed to the pace of a brisk walk. Maintain this rate of closure until translational lift starts to decrease. Apply power to compensate for loss of lift and gradually reduce forward speed to come to a halt on or above the intended touchdown point. Steep approach differs from normal approach only in angle of descent. The steeper angle of descent requires closer monitoring of rate of descent and rate of closure. You will need proficiency in these two maneuvers before you can undertake confined area operation. And in confined area operation, you must also be able to evaluate the area and plan every move you will make in getting into and out of it. Every forest clearing presents its own particular problems. Built-up areas present a completely different set of problems. Are there almost invisible wires or antenna masts? Is there an adequate avenue of approach and landing? Is there sufficient room to safely maneuver the aircraft into a good takeoff position? To answer these questions, you must be able to formulate a sound plan for landing, ground movement, and takeoff. To guide you in confined area operation, you can use a proven 5-step procedure. First, high reconnaissance to plan the entire landing, ground movement, and takeoff. Next, approach according to the plan established in high reconnaissance. Then low reconnaissance to make a final decision on the suitability of the landing area. Followed by ground reconnaissance to plan ground movement and takeoff. Finally, takeoff based on your plan. This confined area procedure should not be new to you. Its value has been proven through years of use. High reconnaissance is definitely the most important of the 5 steps. During high reconnaissance, you make the key decision. You will attempt to land or you will not attempt to land. Each high reconnaissance for a confined area landing is a test of your ability as a professional aviator, and each area will present you with a different problem. Let's examine this area. In a sketch, we can see its features more clearly. Most aviators would first examine the surface on which they intend to land. This surface seems to be ideal, good, level, firm sod, but it might be less ideal. It might have rocks and boulders strewn over its surface. Such obstructions would limit the usable area and make ground movement difficult. Or it might be wet and boggy, perhaps not firm enough to support your aircraft. A dry, sandy surface might cause a blowing dust problem, which would limit visibility on landing and takeoff. If the area had many shrubs or bushes, you'd have to be quite sure they weren't tall enough to interfere with your main or tail rotor. None of these surfaces make landing impossible, but they all must be evaluated carefully as you make your landing and takeoff plan. You'll seldom find a completely desirable area like this. There will almost always be a bad feature, like a large tree in the center of the area. Or a building with fences which obstruct part of the area. Buildings are a clue to another obstruction, wires. Overhead wires are difficult to see. Poles may be difficult to see, but they are your very best clue to wire. In the vicinity of buildings, even deserted structures, you'll frequently find wires. When you've decided that the landing area is clear enough, solid enough, and level enough to land on, you still have the question of how you will land and take off. In answering that question, you will have to take into consideration the wind direction, velocity, and consistency. If, for example, the wind was toward the tall trees at a velocity of 10 to 15 knots, you might consider an approach over the trees, even though they are the tallest barrier. Or you might consider an approach quartering into the wind to gain part of its advantage. But if there was only a 4 or 5 knot wind in this direction, you might consider a downwind approach to avoid the tall trees. Possibly you could use a crosswind approach, since the wind's velocity is not sufficient to be either a help or a hindrance. Wind direction and velocity are important factors, but wind consistency is perhaps more important. A wind blowing at a consistent or continual 10 knots can be a definite help or a definite hindrance depending on its direction. But a wind which is inconsistent and constantly gusts over a wide range can be very dangerous. In a severe gusting situation, confined area landing and takeoff should be attempted with extreme caution. Suppose, for example, you are riding a 20-knot headwind on takeoff, but the wind drops to almost calm. With that additional lift gone, you might just make it over the barrier, or you might not. An inconsistent wind is worse than no wind at all, or even a mild tailwind in confined area work. One more wind factor which must be taken into account during high reconnaissance is a phenomenon called lee effect. Lee effect could be a problem in this landing area if the wind were in this direction over the tall trees. Out from the dense tree barrier is a wide area which is in the lee of the wind. In this area, the wind is masked or blocked. Although there may be a 20-knot wind above the trees, the wind at ground level is nearly calm. Making a normal to steep approach will be tricky. If the sudden drop in wind velocity is anticipated, it can be compensated for without difficulty. If it is not anticipated, the sudden loss of 20 knots of effective airspeed could cause falling through or loss of control. While tall trees can mask the wind, steep hills or tall buildings may have a considerably more noticeable lee effect. On the lee side of a hill, the effect can cause a marked downdraft, which is particularly dangerous in the initial phase of a takeoff or the final phase of landing. In high recon, you must consider wind, terrain, and barriers. You must plan your approach and takeoff paths. Takeoff should be visualized before landing. Final takeoff plans can wait until you're on the ground, but you must be sure you can take off. You must also consider your aircraft's gross weight. You must know the actual weight to properly evaluate the situation. In confined areas, the fuel load, equipment, and passengers must be kept within minimum safe limits. When all of the factors in high reconnaissance have been considered and a firm plan has been formulated, approach is undertaken. It may vary from normal to steep. Approach should never be any steeper than necessary to clear barriers. During approach, you perform your low reconnaissance. Low reconnaissance starts as soon as you are able to clearly see the landing site. It continues until you are sure that you can land according to your previously made plan. If at any time during the approach you are in doubt that you will land successfully, don't wait to find out. Make a go-around. If high recon has been well executed, low recon should give you no surprises. Touchdown should be smooth and right on the previously planned spot. The next step is ground reconnaissance, and it should be performed as soon as possible after landing. Especially in combat, you must be familiar with the area you are occupying. To make a proper ground reconnaissance, it may be necessary to move around on foot. However, with an aircraft as small as the OH-6, it is usually possible to adequately survey the area and plan ground movement without leaving the cockpit. Movement around obstacles is easier in the OH-6 than in many other rotary wing aircraft. The rotor diameter is only 26 feet 4 inches, and the tail boom and rotor only extends beyond the rotor disc approximately 4 feet. This short extension of the tail rotor beyond the rotor disc makes close quarters turning a fairly safe and simple undertaking. The best technique for moving between two obstacles is to move as close to one of them as you can while observing your rotor tip path. Next, you pivot the helicopter around the tail rotor. The tail rotor does not move its position over the ground, so there is no danger of its hitting an obstacle. If you are going to take off immediately, move the helicopter to the takeoff position as soon as you are assured your ground movement and takeoff plans are adequate. If you are going to remain for more than a few minutes, there could be a wind shift and another takeoff point might be more desirable. Takeoff will vary between normal and maximum performance. In confined area takeoff, a tried and true rule should always be used. It's always better to clear a barrier with a safe margin and a good reserve of power than to clear by a wide margin with no reserve power. Here is another type of advanced flying which will test your skill: pinnacle and ridgeline operation. First, let's define pinnacle and ridgeline. A pinnacle may be a mountain peak with the terrain falling away for thousands of feet on all sides. A pinnacle can also be a small but steep hill. Whatever its height, a pinnacle landing site is a small site where the terrain drops away abruptly on all sides. A ridgeline is an area where the land falls away on one or two sides, such as a bluff, a precipice, or a saddle. Ridgelines and pinnacles present a landing problem, primarily because of the effect which they have on the wind. Wind from any direction must flow up one side and then down the other. On the pinnacle, there is an area of severe turbulence at the upwind edge, where the wind rolls over the top of the slope. At the downwind edge, there is a severe downdraft where the wind falls over the downward slope. All across the pinnacle surface, the wind is turbulent and inconsistent in velocity. On tall mountain pinnacles, the wind blows almost continually with practically no periods of calm. Winds at these heights frequently have very high velocity. Though lower pinnacles are not so subject to continual high-velocity winds, the wind pattern is just the same. On the hill's pinnacle, there is an updraft on the windward slope, turbulence at the upwind edge, turbulence and inconsistency across the top, and a downdraft at the downwind edge. Obviously, it is important to know the wind direction and velocity in pinnacle operation. The effective wind over a ridgeline will vary with the wind's direction, but when wind is across the ridgeline, the effect is much the same as on a pinnacle. Generally, the effect is not as violent. In pinnacle and ridgeline work, it is important to learn to visualize the pattern formed by the wind so that you can avoid its violent effects. For example, You would not climb to a pinnacle or ridgeline from the downwind side. The downdraft would make flying difficult, if not dangerous. A climb on the upwind side would give you the benefit of the updraft. High reconnaissance should be made with sufficient altitude to avoid the turbulence. After estimating wind velocity, try to form a mental picture of the pattern of eddies, updrafts, and downdrafts the wind is forming in the area. Without these erratic air currents, landing on a pinnacle would be no harder than landing on an airfield. Select a landing site as far as possible from the turbulence at the upwind edge and the downdraft at the downwind edge. Angle of approach depends on existing conditions: the wind velocity, density altitude, gross weight, and availability of forced landing areas. Approach angle may be anywhere from shallow to steep. It should be remembered, however, that a shallow to normal approach provides greater control of the helicopter. On pinnacle landing, low reconnaissance should be very thorough. Don't hesitate to abort it if your landing site is marginal. If the surface is rough or uneven, let the weight of the helicopter down gradually and with caution. An airspeed over altitude takeoff is made since you automatically have adequate altitude as soon as you clear the edge of the pinnacle. Pinnacle and ridgeline operation, as well as confined area operation, are the type work which only a helicopter can do. Your skill will depend on your ability to plan and to control your aircraft in all situations. Maximum performance takeoff and steep approach are two maneuvers which provide an excellent opportunity to improve your ability in the OH-6. In confined areas, remember that each situation presents a new set of problems. The problems can only be dealt with safely by planning each step with care and by being continually ready to pull up and make a go-around. Pinnacle and ridgeline landing calls for an ability to see the wind and to make the wind work for you rather than against you. With its powerful engine and excellent aerodynamics, the OH-6 is capable, provided the aviator at the controls is equally capable. Diligent practice can give you the ability.